In the bustling city of New York, where skyscrapers pierced the heavens and the restless hum of ambition filled every corner, a young man named Marcus Ellison carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that was not born from wealth or privilege, but from years of relentless struggle, discipline, and the fiery determination of someone who had been underestimated his entire life. Marcus stood tall at 6'1", his lean, athletic frame a testament to years of early morning runs and long nights spent pushing himself beyond his limits. His dark brown skin smooth and radiant under the city lights, his jawline sharp and defined, with a clean-shaven face that revealed high cheekbones and eyes the color of warm chestnut that seemed to see through both lies and illusions. His short-cropped black hair, neat and professional, always kept sharp because he believed that presentation was not only about vanity, but about respect. And he walked with an aura that combined humility with unshakable resolve. The kind of presence that made people turn their heads, even if they did not understand why. And yet, despite this natural charisma, Marcus was not a man who wasted time flaunting himself. Instead, his energy was always focused on building, improving, and creating opportunities that others had told him were impossible. His backstory was one of hardship and resilience, for he was born in the rougher side of Atlanta, raised by a single mother named Lorraine, who worked 2 jobs, one as a nurse's assistant at a community clinic and another as a late-night cashier at a grocery store, to provide for Marcus and his younger sister Jasmine. And it was watching his mother's sacrifices, the tired lines on her face, the way she never complained even when her feet ached and her eyes were red with exhaustion, that forged within Marcus a vow that he would one day create something monumental, not just for himself but for his family, his community, and every young black kid who was told that success was not meant for them. As a teenager, Marcus was intelligent but quiet, preferring books over noise. Though he faced constant ridicule at school from wealthier classmates who mocked his worn shoes and second-hand clothes, yet he refused to let humiliation break him, instead channeling that pain into fuel, studying late into the night, excelling in mathematics, business theory, and computer science. Fields that he discovered through the dusty shelves of the local library because he could not afford expensive courses. And by the time he earned a scholarship to attend a top university in Boston, he had already cultivated the discipline of someone who knew how to fight for survival. So while others partied or indulged in distractions, Marcus was building his first prototypes, tinkering with early ideas for financial software that could help small businesses gain access to credit. Something he knew firsthand was an immense struggle in poor communities where banks refused loans and investors scoffed at the idea of funding minority entrepreneurs. This vision grew with him, and after graduation, he turned down lucrative offers from established firms because he refused to build someone else's empire when he had the spark to ignite his own. So he moved to New York with nothing but a laptop, a dream, and a heart full of determination, renting a tiny studio apartment in Harlem that barely had enough space for a bed and desk, but was filled with the sound of his typing fingers and the glow of his ambition. Years of hard work followed, filled with setbacks, rejections, nights of doubt when Marcus questioned if he had chosen the wrong path. But every time he remembered his mother's weary smile and his sister's hopeful eyes, he rose again, telling himself that quitting was not an option. And slowly, his project, an innovative financial platform designed to connect overlooked entrepreneurs with investors through advanced AI-driven analytics, began to take shape, drawing interest from small local business owners who found his system far more inclusive and intuitive than traditional banking processes. And this was how he finally secured a meeting with a group of wealthy investors who were known in New York as kingmakers, men who could change the fate of a startup with a single signature, though they were equally infamous for their arrogance and ruthless dismissal of anyone they considered beneath them. The day of the meeting, Marcus wore his only tailored navy blue suit, freshly pressed, a crisp white shirt, and a slim black tie. His polished shoes shining as he stepped into the glass tower that housed the investment firm Hamilton and Cross Capital, a firm co-founded by Richard Hamilton, a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair slicked back, sharp blue eyes, and a reputation for being cutthroat in negotiations. And Charles Cross, his partner, slightly younger but equally imposing with a heavy-set build, ruddy complexion, and a booming laugh that often masked his cruelty. Men who had spent decades building fortunes off the backs of startups, some of which they nurtured, but many of which they had crushed with merciless indifference. Marcus had prepared his pitch carefully, rehearsed every line until it flowed like music, but as soon as he entered the sleek boardroom with its polished mahogany table and panoramic view of Manhattan, he sensed the tension in the air. For seated at the table alongside Hamilton and Cross were two other investors. Gregory Sterling, a slender man with thinning blonde hair, sharp angular features, and a habit of drumming his manicured fingers on the table as though he were bored of everyone around him, and Anthony Caldwell, a bearded man with salt and pepper hair, round glasses, and an air of smug superiority. Men who had made millions in tech but were notorious for their dismissive attitude toward minority founders. And as Marcus introduced himself, placing his laptop on the table to begin his presentation, he could already see the smirks on their faces, the way they exchanged glances as though they had already decided this meeting was nothing more than a source of entertainment. Still, Marcus spoke with clarity and passion, outlining his platform's ability to reduce bias in funding decisions, to democratize investment opportunities for underserved entrepreneurs, to generate returns not only financially, but socially. Yet the investors barely hid their condescension, chuckling under their breath, whispering comments to one another as if Marcus were a comedian performing rather than a visionary presenting a revolution. And at one point, Charles Cross interrupted with a booming laugh, saying, "So let me get this straight. You think you, a kid from Harlem, can fix a system that has been this way for centuries? Do you have any idea how the real world works?" Which triggered further laughter from Sterling and Caldwell, their voices echoing off the high glass walls like cruel thunder. And though Marcus felt the sting of humiliation pierce his chest, though his throat tightened and his fists clenched beneath the table, he forced himself to maintain composure, answering with calm confidence, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break, because deep down he knew something they did not, that he was far closer to success than they imagined, that behind their laughter he could already see the cracks in their arrogance, and that soon the tables would turn in ways they could not predict. But for now, he let them laugh. He let them dismiss him, because he understood that sometimes the sweetest revenge was patience. And as the meeting ended with Hamilton waving his hand dismissively, saying, "Thank you, Mr. Ellison, but we're not interested in fairy tales," Marcus gathered his laptop, adjusted his tie, and walked out of that tower not defeated, but burning with a fire so intense it could light the whole city, whispering to himself that their laughter would soon become silence, and that silence would be worth more than all the millions they thought he would never touch. Marcus walked out of Hamilton and Cross Capital's sleek tower into the heart of Manhattan, with the echoes of their laughter still ringing in his ears. But instead of crushing him, the sound fueled a deeper rage mixed with determination. And as he moved through the sea of polished suits and hurried pedestrians, he kept replaying the moment Charles Cross leaned back with that booming laugh and said his dream was a fairy tale. Because Marcus knew that history was full of men who mocked what they could not comprehend until those same visions became empires. And he promised himself that the next time he stood before them, it would not be as a man begging for scraps, but as an equal, or more, as a man holding their fate in his hands. Yet in that moment, though, Marcus had bills to pay and a company barely afloat, so he returned to his Harlem studio apartment, a cramped space with peeling paint on the walls, a squeaky radiator, and a small desk cluttered with notebooks full of scribbled algorithms, coffee cups, and a framed picture of his mother and sister smiling proudly at his college graduation. An image that never failed to remind him why he endured humiliation without surrendering. And as he sat down, he pulled up the dashboard of his platform, FinPath, and reviewed the latest metrics, seeing that small business owners across the Bronx and Brooklyn had started to use his pilot version to connect with local credit unions. Proof that his idea had teeth even if arrogant men in glass towers failed to see it. But Marcus knew passion alone wouldn't pay for servers or marketing, So he needed allies. And it was then that he reached out to two of the few people he trusted. His childhood friend, Daniel Carter, and a software engineer named Priya Kapoor. Daniel was a man of medium height, muscular build, with a round face and an ever-present grin, his short hair neatly cut, and his brown eyes always filled with humor that masked a deep loyalty forged during their teenage years in Atlanta, when he had often defended Marcus against bullies. And though Daniel lacked a college degree, he had a gift for people, an ability to charm customers, negotiate deals, and hustle in ways that Marcus admired. So Marcus had brought him on as head of outreach. Priya, on the other hand, was a woman in her late 20s, originally from New Jersey, slender with long black hair tied neatly into a ponytail, warm brown skin, almond-shaped dark eyes that revealed a sharp intelligence, and a calm voice that could turn chaos into clarity. A daughter of immigrant parents who had sacrificed everything to give her an education, and she had graduated top of her class in computer science at MIT, choosing to work with Marcus not because of money, since he could barely afford to pay her at the time, but because she believed in his mission of democratizing opportunity, having seen her own father struggle to secure loans for his small convenience store despite decades of honest work. Together, the three of them formed a small but determined team, working out of Marcus's apartment with laptops balanced on makeshift desks, fueled by takeout meals and cheap coffee. And though resources were scarce, their drive was abundant. For each night they coded, tested, refined, and debated features of FinPath, sometimes arguing passionately, but always united by the belief that they were building something transformative. And as the weeks turned into months, word began to spread among minority-owned businesses that FinPath was a lifeline, a way to access fair capital without the barriers of bias. And slowly but steadily, their user base grew. Yet for every step forward, obstacles loomed. For larger fintech companies began to notice his innovation, and rumors swirled that some were considering copying his model. While on the personal side, Marcus carried the weight of his mother's declining health. Lorraine now suffering from chronic back pain after years of double shifts. Though she never complained when Marcus visited her in Atlanta on weekends, always smiling and insisting she was proud of him, urging him never to give up no matter how hard things became. And Jasmine, now in college studying journalism, constantly reminded him through late-night phone calls that his story was not just his, but theirs, that he carried the hopes of a family and a community every time he stepped into those boardrooms. Meanwhile, across town in Hamilton and Cross's gilded offices, Richard Hamilton and Charles Cross barely gave Marcus another thought, dismissing him as another dreamer who would soon fade away. Though Gregory Sterling, ever the cynical opportunist, occasionally joked to Caldwell about that Harlem kid with his fairy tale bank, drawing more laughter as they signed million-dollar deals with established firms. But what they failed to realize was that Marcus had begun networking quietly with mid-level investors who, unlike the old guard, were hungry for fresh ideas. People like Olivia Bennett, a 35-year-old venture capitalist with auburn hair that flowed over her shoulders, piercing green eyes behind thin-framed glasses, and a reputation for spotting underdog talent. A woman who had grown disillusioned with the arrogance of her male counterparts, and who, upon meeting Marcus at a small tech conference in Brooklyn, was struck not only by his intelligence, but by the sincerity in his voice when he spoke about breaking cycles of exclusion. And though her fund was modest compared to Hamilton and Cross, she provided crucial seed capital and mentorship that allowed Marcus to expand FinPath's reach. Under Olivia's guidance, Marcus polished his pitch strategies, refined his financial models, and gained access to networking events that had previously been closed to him. And soon, FinPath's name began circulating in circles far larger than he had ever imagined, gaining attention from media outlets that were hungry for stories of disruption. Still, with every victory came skepticism, and online forums buzzed with doubt, with anonymous commenters mocking Marcus's background, sneering that some kid from Harlem could never stand against Wall Street titans. But Marcus had grown immune to such noise, reminding himself daily that ridicule was often the last refuge of the threatened. And instead, he focused on scaling his platform, hiring a few more engineers, expanding to a shared co-working space in downtown Manhattan where his team could collaborate more effectively. And it was here, in this new space buzzing with energy, that Marcus often stayed until dawn, staring at code until his eyes blurred, then scribbling strategy notes in a worn leather notebook that he carried everywhere, a notebook filled with dreams, calculations, and a growing list of names of investors who had laughed at him. A list he kept not out of bitterness, but as a reminder that one day he would return to each name with undeniable proof of his triumph. As FinPath's influence grew, opportunities multiplied, and Marcus found himself invited to panels, interviews, and demo days, though every time he stood before an audience, dressed in that same navy blue suit, he carried with him not just a business pitch, but the story of a boy from Atlanta who had refused to believe that poverty defined his destiny. And audiences listened, some skeptical, others inspired, yet all recognizing that there was something different about Marcus, a presence that could not be ignored. And behind the scenes, as Olivia predicted, larger firms began circling like sharks, sensing blood in the water, considering whether to acquire or crush him. But Marcus, remembering the cruelty of Hamilton and Cross, vowed he would never sell out too soon, that he would build FinPath strong enough to stand on its own, even if it meant more sleepless nights, more battles with doubt, because he knew the day was coming when the laughter of those investors would return to haunt them. Only this time, it would be silenced by the sound of his victory, a victory he could already taste every time he saw a small business owner finally secure the funding they deserved through his platform, every time he read an email of gratitude from someone who had once been ignored. And though the road ahead was perilous, Marcus felt the storm inside him growing, and with it the certainty that destiny was bending in his direction. The months that followed marked a turning point in Marcus Ellison's journey. For while the memory of Hamilton and Cross's derisive laughter remained etched into his mind like a scar that never healed, the reality outside those glass towers was that FinPath was no longer a fledgling idea, scribbled in notebooks and coded in the dim light of his Harlem apartment. It was becoming a force whispered about in circles of entrepreneurs, tech journalists, and even cautious investors who had once dismissed him. And as momentum built, Marcus's life shifted into an unforgiving rhythm of high-pressure meetings by day, relentless coding sessions by night, and constant travel between boroughs to connect with business owners who used his platform. Each story he heard from them becoming fuel for his mission, like that of Teresa Alvarez, a petite woman in her 40s with calloused hands and kind eyes who ran a small bakery in Queens and had been rejected by banks despite years of profitable operation, until FinPath connected her with a credit union that granted her the capital to expand. And when she hugged Marcus with tears streaming down her flour-dusted face, he felt more validation than any dismissive investor could deny him. Yet success was never linear, for with growth came opposition, and Marcus soon discovered that some powerful incumbents viewed him not as an underdog to be pitied, but as a threat to be neutralized. Among them, a billionaire named Victor Langley, a tall, imposing man in his early 60s with a mane of silver hair, a square jaw covered by a neatly trimmed beard, and piercing grey eyes that carried the cold calculation of someone who had built his empire by crushing competition. Langley had made his fortune in traditional banking and fintech acquisitions, and he considered Marcus's model dangerously disruptive to the status quo that had enriched him for decades. So behind the scenes, he began whisper campaigns that painted FinPath as unstable, leaking stories to the press about algorithmic risks and unproven leadership, while simultaneously instructing his legal teams to explore regulatory loopholes that could slow Marcus down. Marcus felt the weight of these attacks, especially as articles appeared questioning his credibility, dissecting his background as though growing up in poverty was a crime, mocking him with headlines like "Harlem Dreamer thinks he can outrun Wall Street." Yet instead of deterring him, each insult sharpened his focus, and during one late night in the co-working space, as rain pelted the windows and Priya tapped furiously at her keyboard refining code while Daniel paced on the phone negotiating with potential clients, Marcus stood looking at the city skyline and whispered to himself that storms had always been his environment, and he was not about to drown now. It was during this period of turbulence that Marcus met an unlikely ally, a man named Henry Whitman, a retired banker in his 70s who had grown disillusioned with the greed of his peers. Henry was tall and lanky, with stooped shoulders, wispy white hair, and kind blue eyes that contrasted with the sharp suits he still wore. And though he spoke slowly, his words carried the weight of decades of experience. He approached Marcus after a panel discussion where Marcus had spoken passionately about financial justice, telling him in a raspy voice that reminded Marcus of his grandfather, "They will try to break you, son, because you scare them. And that means you are doing something right." And from that day, Henry became an informal advisor, offering wisdom, connecting Marcus with older contacts who still believed in integrity, and reminding him that endurance was as powerful a weapon as innovation. Buoyed by this support, Marcus pressed on, and soon Olivia Bennett secured him a chance to present at one of the largest venture showcases in the country, a glittering event in San Francisco, attended by hundreds of investors, tech leaders, and media outlets, a stage that could propel FinPath into the mainstream if Marcus succeeded, but also one where failure would be broadcast across the entire industry. Preparing for this event consumed him for weeks, with rehearsals stretching late into the night, Olivia critiquing his every gesture, Priya fine-tuning the product demo, Daniel working his network to ensure journalists would be in the audience, and Marcus himself grappling with the pressure of not only representing his company, but also carrying the invisible weight of every entrepreneur of color who had ever been laughed out of a boardroom. And when the day finally arrived, he stepped onto the stage in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, his voice steady yet powerful as he told his story, not as a plea for charity, but as a declaration of inevitability. And when he revealed the latest metrics showing exponential growth in user adoption and repayment success rates, the audience erupted in applause. Reporters scribbled furiously, and several investors rushed to speak with him afterward, eager not to miss out on what they now recognized as the future. Among those impressed was a tech magnate named Evelyn Park, a Korean-American billionaire in her early 50s with jet black hair cut into a sharp bob, flawless porcelain skin, and a reputation for investing in groundbreaking technologies. Evelyn approached Marcus with genuine respect, telling him she saw in him the same hunger she once carried when building her own empire. And though she did not commit on the spot, she hinted at the possibility of a strategic partnership that could catapult FinPath globally, an opportunity Marcus dared not imagine a year earlier when he was scraping together rent. Yet even as new doors opened, enemies grew restless, for Victor Langley attended the same showcase and watched from the audience with thinly veiled disdain, later scoffing to a colleague that this kid will burn bright for a season and then collapse like the rest. But in his gut he knew Marcus was different, and that terrified him, so he resolved to accelerate his campaign of sabotage, calling in favors from regulators, leveraging his media influence, and whispering to allies at Hamilton and Cross that they might have dismissed Marcus too quickly. Meanwhile, Marcus returned to New York to a hero's welcome from his team. But rather than celebrate, he pushed harder, expanding operations, onboarding new staff, and securing a larger office space in Midtown, a place with glass walls, modern furniture, and the energy of a company on the rise. Though he insisted on keeping his old leather notebook on his desk as a reminder of humble beginnings. It was in this office that his team adopted a stray dog. They found wandering outside one rainy night, a scruffy brown mutt with floppy ears, soulful eyes, and a tail that wagged timidly as if unsure of its welcome. They named him Lucky, and soon the dog became a fixture in the office, his presence lifting morale during stressful nights, curling up beside Marcus's desk as though guarding him from despair. And Marcus often joked that Lucky was the company's chief happiness officer. But deep down, he felt the dog was a symbol of their journey, unwanted by others, yet destined for a home where he truly belonged. As FinPath's reputation soared, journalists who once doubted him now clamored for interviews, painting him as the face of a new generation of entrepreneurs. Though Marcus never let the praise inflate his ego, always returning to the same mantra that his mother instilled in him: humility and persistence. And during visits back to Atlanta, he shared every milestone with Lorraine, who, despite her pain, stood taller with pride, while Jasmine wrote glowing articles about her brother's rise in her college newspaper, framing him not just as her sibling, but as a beacon for young people like her. Still, the shadow of Hamilton and Cross lingered, for word reached Marcus that Gregory Sterling had scoffed during a private dinner, saying he would bet a fortune that Marcus would never last 5 years. And while Marcus smiled when he heard this, adding Sterling's name more boldly to his notebook list, he also knew that their arrogance blinded them to the storm building on the horizon. A storm that would soon sweep through their empire and leave them face to face with the very man they once mocked. As FinPath surged into its next phase of growth, Marcus Ellison felt both exhilaration and exhaustion coursing through his veins. For while the world around him finally began to recognize his brilliance, the pressure to maintain momentum became relentless. And with every article that praised him as a rising star of fintech came new challenges from competitors and enemies who sharpened their knives in silence. Chief among them, Victor Langley, whose calculated attacks grew more sophisticated, exploiting every regulatory loophole, spreading whispers about FinPath's solvency, and even planting stories in major financial publications suggesting that Marcus was nothing more than a charismatic frontman whose product was untested. Yet despite these attempts to shake him, Marcus remained unbowed, standing tall in his new Midtown office, a sleek space filled with glass walls that overlooked the pulsing heart of Manhattan, where his small but growing team worked tirelessly under the glow of monitors and the watchful eye of Lucky, the scruffy brown mutt who had quickly become the company mascot, trotting between desks with cheerful barks and curling up by Marcus's chair during late-night work sessions, as though sensing his master's weight of responsibility. Within the team, dynamics deepened. Daniel Carter, ever the hustler, proved invaluable in forging connections with community leaders and local chambers of commerce, his easy charm and quick wit making him a natural at winning trust. Though beneath his grin lay a fiery loyalty to Marcus that had only grown since their teenage years, and Priya Kapoor, with her sharp intellect and steady composure, evolved into the backbone of FinPath's technical architecture, her slender frame bent over screens filled with lines of complex code, her dark eyes radiating focus, and while she rarely raised her voice, when she spoke, her words cut through noise with clarity that earned her the quiet respect of everyone around her. And together, this trio of dreamers became a family bound by shared struggle rather than blood. Outside the office, Marcus found his personal world shifting as well. For Olivia Bennett, the auburn-haired investor who had first believed in him, became more than just a mentor. Their late-night strategy meetings often stretching into deep conversations about life, dreams, and scars. And though Marcus hesitated at first, wary of mixing business with emotion, he found himself drawn to her sharp mind, her piercing green eyes, and the way she looked at him, not as a novelty or an underdog, but as a man capable of reshaping an industry, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, a quiet bond blossomed between them, one that gave Marcus strength even as external pressures mounted. Those pressures came to a head when Marcus received an unexpected invitation to a prestigious investment forum hosted by none other than Hamilton and Cross Capital, the very men who had once laughed him out of their boardroom. And though, at first he suspected it was a ploy to humiliate him again, Olivia encouraged him to attend, reminding him that sometimes walking into the lion's den was the best way to remind the beast, "You are no longer prey." So Marcus accepted, preparing himself meticulously, dressing in a midnight black tailored suit that accentuated his tall frame and powerful shoulders, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his clean-shaven face radiating determination. And when he entered the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria that evening, chandeliers casting golden light over a sea of tuxedos and gowns, conversations hushed slightly at the sight of him, whispers rippling across the room as attendees recognized the man whose name had been flooding financial headlines. Seated at the head table were Richard Hamilton with his slicked-back silver hair and icy blue gaze, Charles Cross with his booming laugh and ruddy complexion, Gregory Sterling tapping his manicured fingers impatiently, and Anthony Caldwell stroking his salt and pepper beard while smirking with disdain. The very quartet that had once reduced Marcus to the butt of their jokes. And as Marcus approached, holding his head high, he saw their expressions flicker with surprise before quickly hardening into masks of indifference. Yet the shift was not lost on him, for in that moment he realized he no longer came as a supplicant, but as a peer they could not easily dismiss. The evening proceeded with speeches and networking, and when it was Marcus's turn to present, he took the stage with steady composure, weaving a narrative not of pity, but of progress, showing data of FinPath's exponential growth, testimonials from business owners lifted by his platform, and projections that hinted at a future too big for even the largest firms to ignore. And as he spoke, he noticed the audience leaning forward, captivated, while Hamilton and Cross shifted uncomfortably, Sterling's smirk fading and Caldwell's fingers tightening on his glass. Yet, true to form, they could not resist a final jab. For after the applause subsided, Charles Cross rose with mock generosity, his booming voice filling the hall as he said, "Impressive story, Mr. Ellison, but let's be real. Success in this city isn't about dreams, it's about power, and you're still just one man against an army." Laughter rippled again, though this time it was strained, uncertain, and Marcus, refusing to flinch, simply smiled and replied with calm authority, "Sometimes one man with a vision can build an army bigger than anyone expects." A line that drew murmurs of admiration from the crowd and left his detractors momentarily silenced. After the forum, as Marcus mingled with attendees congratulating him, he caught sight of Victor Langley speaking quietly with Hamilton and Cross at the edge of the room, their expressions grim, their eyes occasionally darting toward him. And though Marcus could not hear their words, he sensed that alliances were being forged against him, alliances born of fear, and he knew the battles ahead would be fierce. But he also knew that fear was the surest sign he was on the right path. Returning to his office that night, greeted by Lucky's wagging tail and his team's cheers for his performance, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, staring at the city lights outside his window. And he whispered to himself that no matter how powerful his enemies seemed, no matter how loudly they laughed, he would never bow. For the fire within him had grown too strong, and he was ready not just to fight for survival, but to conquer, to rise so high that even the men who once mocked him would have no choice but to kneel. The weeks after the investment forum marked the beginning of a new era for Marcus Ellison and FinPath, because while the applause from that golden ballroom still echoed in his memory, the true victory lay in the tidal wave of opportunities that came crashing in afterward, offers from venture capitalists who once ignored his emails, partnerships proposed by institutions that previously denied him a seat at their table, and media outlets now eager to paint him as the face of disruption in finance. Yet with every handshake and every congratulatory headline, Marcus carried a cautious heart, for he knew well that in the shadows, men like Richard Hamilton, Charles Cross, Gregory Sterling, Anthony Caldwell, and Victor Langley were sharpening their daggers. And if history had taught him anything, it was that those who laughed loudest in mockery would soon conspire most viciously in silence. Nevertheless, Marcus pressed forward, securing a landmark deal with Evelyn Park, the Korean-American magnate whose reputation as a visionary was matched only by her ruthlessness in scaling businesses. And together, they announced a partnership that would expand FinPath globally, starting with pilot programs in London, Nairobi, and Mumbai, initiatives that sent shockwaves through the financial sector and triggered a flurry of panicked meetings inside the gilded offices of Hamilton and Cross, where Hamilton himself slammed his fist on the table and barked that Ellison had to be stopped before he became untouchable, to which Langley coolly replied that he had methods of dismantling upstarts, his grey eyes gleaming with cold calculation. While these men plotted, Marcus and his team were living in a whirlwind of progress, their midtown office buzzing day and night with engineers scaling infrastructure, Daniel Carter negotiating deals with foreign chambers of commerce, Priya Kapoor refining security protocols to fend off cyber attacks she suspected were already being tested against their systems, and Olivia Bennet managing investor relations with poise and precision, her auburn hair glinting under office lights as she guided Marcus through the treacherous waters of sudden fame. While Lucky, the scruffy brown mutt, became something of a celebrity mascot, often appearing in social media posts that framed FinPath not only as an innovative company, but as a movement with heart. Still, Marcus himself found little time to bask in glory, because every night he returned to his glass-walled corner office, loosened his tie, and pored over reports until his eyes blurred. His leather notebook always at his side, now filled with not only names of those who doubted him, but also intricate diagrams of acquisition strategies. For though he rarely admitted it aloud, the seed of vengeance had taken root in his mind, and he no longer dreamed merely of proving his worth. He envisioned a future where he would sit at the helm of an empire so vast that the men who once mocked him would wake up one day to find their own companies no longer theirs. This vision gained fuel when Olivia introduced him to a circle of international investors who believed in his mission and provided not just capital, but influence. And through them, Marcus began quietly acquiring stakes in struggling financial firms, using shell companies and strategic partnerships to conceal his growing reach. Moves that mirrored the very tactics Hamilton and Langley had used for decades, except now wielded by the man they once dismissed as a fairy tale dreamer. Meanwhile, in his personal life, Marcus wrestled with the changes success brought. From strangers recognizing him on the street to tabloids speculating about his relationship with Olivia, yet he remained grounded by frequent trips back to Atlanta, where he would sit at his mother Lorraine's small kitchen table, holding her aging hands and telling her that every battle he fought was for her sacrifices. While Jasmine, now an ambitious young journalist with a sharp pen and sharper instincts, urged him to document his journey honestly, reminding him that transparency was as powerful a weapon as capital. But storms gathered quickly, for Langley escalated his assault by pressuring regulators to audit FinPath, unleashing a swarm of bureaucratic hurdles designed to slow progress, and simultaneously orchestrating leaks that painted Marcus as reckless, whispers amplified by Sterling and Caldwell at private dinners, where they scoffed about the boy from Harlem who thinks he owns the world. And though these attacks dented his public image briefly, Marcus responded with masterful composure, appearing on television interviews with his crisp suits and unwavering gaze, explaining calmly that scrutiny was natural for any disruptor and that FinPath welcomed oversight because it only proved their resilience, a performance so commanding that even critics begrudgingly admired him. Yet behind closed doors, Marcus seethed, his jaw tight, as he told Priya and Daniel late one night that their enemies would not stop until FinPath was ashes, and that if survival required fire, then fire they would bring. Words that marked the true pivot of his journey from dreamer to tactician, from builder to conqueror. In the months that followed, Marcus orchestrated a campaign of his own, securing patents to lock competitors out, expanding into international markets where Langley's influence was weaker, and most importantly, quietly assembling a war chest through global partnerships that would soon allow him to make a move no one expected, a move so bold it would flip the very balance of power. And as he stood in his office one stormy evening, Lucky asleep at his feet, Olivia by his side, studying spreadsheets, and his team buzzing in the background, Marcus gazed out at the city skyline and whispered to himself that the day of reckoning was coming. The day when laughter would be silenced not by words, but by ownership. And he felt in his bones that he was destined to walk back into Hamilton and Cross not as a petitioner, but as a master of their fate. And when that day came, their mocking voices would finally tremble with the realization that the boy they ridiculed had become the man who owned their world. The morning of Marcus Ellison's ultimate move began like any other in New York. The city thrumming with relentless energy as taxis honked, pedestrians rushed across crowded streets, and skyscrapers shimmered beneath the rising sun. But inside FinPath's Midtown headquarters, the air was electric with anticipation. For after years of struggle, humiliation, and relentless perseverance, Marcus stood on the precipice of a moment that would not only vindicate his vision, but reshape the very landscape of finance. In his glass-walled office, The tall, broad-shouldered man adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit, his clean-shaven face calm, but his chestnut eyes burning with controlled fire. His leather notebook, now filled from cover to cover with strategies, names and dreams, lying open on the desk beside him, and at his feet, Lucky, the scruffy brown mutt who had been rescued in the rain months ago, lifted his head as if sensing the gravity of the day. Around him, his team moved like a well-trained army. Daniel Carter, pacing with his phone pressed to his ear, closing last-minute communications with journalists, his muscular frame and round face glistening with excitement. Priya Kapoor seated at her workstation, her dark almond eyes sharp as she monitored streams of data flowing across multiple screens, her slender fingers typing commands to ensure their system's stability. And Olivia Bennett, auburn hair glowing under the office lights, green eyes steady behind her glasses as she reviewed contracts with a level of precision that had made her Marcus's most trusted strategist and confidant, while in the background, junior engineers, analysts, and assistants buzzed with purpose, all aware that they were about to be part of history. Marcus's plan, months in the making, was simple in its brilliance, yet audacious in execution. Through a network of international shell companies, global investors, and silent partnerships, he had quietly accumulated a controlling interest in Hamilton and Cross Capital itself, the very firm whose mahogany boardroom had once echoed with mocking laughter at his expense. And today, at the firm's quarterly shareholder meeting, Marcus would reveal his position and execute the buyout that would flip power on its head, seizing control of the empire built by Richard Hamilton, Charles Cross, Gregory Sterling, and Anthony Caldwell, men who had epitomized the arrogance of an old guard, convinced that wealth was their birthright. As Marcus prepared to leave for the meeting, he paused by the office window, gazing at the skyline where ambition had always loomed larger than mercy, and he whispered to himself words his mother had once spoken: "Let them laugh, baby, because laughter fades when the truth arrives." And with that, he slipped his notebook into his briefcase, gave Lucky a reassuring pat, and strode toward the waiting black sedan where Olivia and Daniel joined him, their presence a shield against the storm ahead. Across town, in the lavish headquarters of Hamilton and Cross, Richard Hamilton adjusted his silver hair in a mirror, his sharp blue eyes reflecting irritation more than confidence. For rumors had begun to swirl that Marcus Ellison was preparing something significant. And though Hamilton scoffed outwardly, calling him a boy with dreams bigger than his wallet, an unease gnawed at him, mirrored in the tense frown of Charles Cross, whose ruddy complexion grew redder with each report of Finpath's expansion, while Sterling and Caldwell, seated in leather chairs with their usual smugness, reassured one another that no upstart could topple them, blind to the fact that the noose was already tightening around their empire. When Marcus entered the towering building's marble lobby, his presence drew whispers from employees and attendees. For here was the man they had once dismissed as irrelevant, now walking with the calm authority of destiny, his tall frame cutting through the crowd as though guided by unseen force. Olivia and Daniel at his side like lieutenants entering a battlefield. And when he stepped into the grand boardroom, its walls lined with oil paintings of old financial titans and its long mahogany table gleaming beneath golden chandeliers, the room fell momentarily silent before Hamilton greeted him with a tight smile that failed to mask contempt, saying, "Mr. Ellison, we didn't expect you here today." To which Marcus replied with quiet steel, "That's because you never expect the people you underestimate to return." His words slicing through the air with the precision of a blade. The meeting began with formalities, reports, and presentations, Hamilton speaking in his practiced tone about profits and strategies. But as he droned on, Marcus leaned forward, opened his briefcase, and slid documents onto the table, his voice calm yet resonant as he interrupted. "Gentlemen, before you continue, I believe it's time you reviewed the updated shareholder registry." And when the executives glanced down at the papers, their smug expressions dissolved into shock. For line by line, it revealed the truth, that Marcus Ellison, through layered acquisitions, partnerships, and silent investors, had amassed a controlling majority stake in Hamilton and Cross Capital, making him not just a guest at their table, But their new master. Silence blanketed the room, broken only by the sound of Charles Cross's booming laugh, turning into a sputter of disbelief as he stammered, This is impossible," while Sterling's pale face drained of colour, and Caldwell's hands trembled around his glass. And Hamilton, though trying to maintain composure, could not hide the flicker of panic in his icy eyes as he muttered, "What have you done?" To which Marcus rose to his full height, his presence towering over them, and declared with unwavering conviction, "I've done what you said I never could. I've turned your laughter into my leverage, your dismissal into my power, and today, Hamilton and Cross belongs to me." Gasps filled the boardroom as shareholders whispered, some even applauding, for many had grown weary of the arrogance of the old guard, and now saw in Marcus the fresh leadership they had long desired. And as the realization settled, Hamilton sank into his chair, his silver head bowed, Cross's face red with fury, Sterling's hands trembling as he muttered excuses, and Caldwell, silent for once, his smugness evaporated, while Marcus, calm as ever, gathered his papers, looked each man in the eye, and said, "You laughed at me when I walked into this room years ago, but today I don't hear laughter. Today I hear silence. And silence, gentlemen, is the sound of change." Before walking out with Olivia and Daniel by his side, the weight of history behind him and the future ahead, while outside journalists clamoured for answers, their cameras flashing as Marcus stood before them and declared that the age of exclusion was ending, that Finpath and Hamilton and Cross together would serve as instruments of inclusion, innovation, and justice, a promise that resonated across the financial world. That night, back in his office, Marcus removed his tie, sat at his desk with Lucky curled at his feet, and opened his worn leather notebook to the last page, where beneath the list of names he had carried for so long, he wrote a single word in bold strokes: conquered. Then closed the book with a quiet smile. For though battles would continue and challenges would rise, the boy from Atlanta who once endured laughter had become the man who owned the empire. And in that transformation lay not just victory, but legacy, one that would echo for generations.